The sun rose pale over Henderson Field, burning the mist off the jungle in slow, golden sheets. Heat pressed down even this early, thick with fuel fumes and salt from the sea. Somewhere beyond the palms, waves rolled against the shore, steady and uncaring. Lieutenant Jack Mallory stood beside his P-38 Lightning, helmet tucked under one arm, watching mechanics swarm over the aircraft like ants on a fallen branch. The twin engines clicked as they cooled, metal ticking softly, as if the plane itself were breathing. He hadn't slept. None of them had. The night before, word had come down. Japanese air activity increasing. Zeros had been spotted staging north of the islands. Everyone knew what that meant. Another push, another test of who would still be alive by sunset. Jack ran a hand along the cold aluminum fuselage. "Just get me home," he muttered. Nearby, Staff Sergeant Eli Warren crouched under the wing, tightening a panel with a wrench darkened by oil and sweat. He'd been awake even longer than the pilots. Mechanics always were. When the men flew, they waited. When the men slept, they worked. Eli glanced up at the aircraft's control linkage, jaw tight. He'd watched too many pilots come back shaken, or not come back at all. The P-38 was fast, faster than anything the Japanese had, but once it dove hard, the controls could stiffen like they were frozen in concrete. A pilot could do everything right and still die. He wiped his hands on a rag and muttered, "There's gotta be a way." The sound of engines starting rippled across the airfield. "Mount up!" someone shouted. Jack climbed into the cockpit, straps snapping into place. The canopy slid shut, sealing him inside a bubble of glass and noise. The engines roared to life, vibrating through his bones. He checked the gauges, felt the familiar mix of fear and anticipation coil in his chest. The Lightning rolled forward, lifted, and clawed into the sky. Above the clouds, the world looked calm, too calm. Sunlight shimmered off the ocean far below, blindingly bright. Then the radio crackled. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, multiple contacts." Jack's grip tightened. Dark specks grew rapidly larger, resolving into the unmistakable shapes of Zero fighters diving out of the sun. "Here they come," he whispered. The sky exploded into motion. Tracers streaked past his canopy. A Zero flashed by so close he could see the red circle on its wing. Jack shoved the throttle forward and pulled into a turn, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The controls fought back. The stick grew heavy in his hand. Not again. A Zero slid onto his tail. Jack shoved the nose down, diving hard, airspeed screaming past the red line. The aircraft began to shudder. The controls stiffened, locking like they'd been welded in place. "Come on, come on!" he grunted, forcing the stick with both hands. The Zero's guns opened up. Tracers ripped past his wingtip. At the last second, the resistance eased just enough. Jack hauled the nose up, barely clearing the ocean by a few hundred feet. The Japanese fighter overshot, flashing past in a blur of gray and red. Jack gasped, lungs burning. He climbed back toward the clouds, heart hammering, knowing how close he'd just come to dying. Around him, the sky was chaos, smoke trails, falling aircraft, the crackle of radio calls cut short mid-sentence. And down on the ground, back at Henderson Field, Eli Warren listened to the distant thunder of combat and stared at the piece of wire lying on his workbench. He picked it up slowly, turning it between his fingers. "Maybe," he whispered. "Maybe this is enough." Above the Pacific, the battle raged on. Unaware that somewhere below, a small, almost foolish idea was about to change the way the war in the sky would be fought. The afternoon heat lay heavy over Henderson Field when the first damaged aircraft limped back in. Smoke trailed from one engine, paint scorched and peeling. The P-38 bounced hard on the runway, skidded, and finally rolled to a stop. Ground crews ran toward it as the canopy popped open and the pilot climbed out, legs shaking. "Still flying," he said, voice hoarse. "Don't know how." But she held together. Eli was already moving before anyone finished talking. He crouched beneath the wing, hands tracing scorched metal, eyes searching the control linkages. The aircraft smelled of burned oil and fear. Yet the elevator cables, normally stretched and warped after a dive, were intact. He swallowed hard. That night, while the jungle hummed with insects and distant artillery, Eli worked under a lantern's glow. No officers, no permission. Just a man and his instincts. He reinforced the linkage with a crude tension system, threading wire with careful precision, testing it again and again. Each pull of the stick felt smoother, more forgiving. By dawn, 3 aircraft carried the modification. Jack climbed into his cockpit with a strange calm settling over him. He didn't ask questions. In war, trust came fast or not at all. The next scramble came before breakfast. Enemy bombers were inbound, escorted, organized, confident. The Americans climbed hard to meet them, sun at their backs. As the formations closed, the sky turned violent. Explosions punched holes in the clouds, tracers curved like fiery ribbons. Jack pushed his P-38 into a dive, faster than he ever dared before. The stick resisted, then moved. Clean, smooth. His heart slammed in his chest as he pulled up, carving a tight arc that should have torn the wings clean off. Instead, the aircraft obeyed. A Zero streaked past his canopy, the pilot's eyes wide with shock. Jack fired. The enemy plane burst into flame and fell away, spinning toward the ocean. All around him, the impossible was happening. P-38s were turning with the Zeros, diving and climbing without locking up, surviving maneuvers that had once been death sentences. The Japanese formation broke, pilots scattering in confusion as the Americans pressed the attack. Minutes later, the sky fell quiet. Smoke drifted across the blue like ghosts. Back on the ground, men gathered in stunned silence as aircraft returned, more than anyone had dared hope. Mechanics stared at the planes, then at the small modification gleaming under the skin of each wing. Word traveled fast. Within weeks, the fix was ordered across the theater. Not with fanfare, not with medals, just typed memos and quiet nods of approval. The war rolled on, brutal and unrelenting, but fewer pilots failed to return. Fewer empty bunks waited at dawn. Years later, long after the guns fell silent, Jack would stand at a memorial and think about that morning. The fear, the noise, the impossible turn that saved his life. He'd remember a mechanic with grease-stained hands and a simple idea no one was supposed to try. Wars are often remembered by names carved in stone and victories marked on maps. But sometimes, history turns on a wire bent by hand in the dark, and on the courage of those who trusted it enough to fly. Years passed, and the war moved on without waiting for anyone to catch their breath. New aircraft replaced the old. New pilots arrived wide-eyed and left hollowed. The Pacific swallowed wrecks, names, and entire stories without ceremony. But among the men who had flown the early days, those who had felt the sky turn against them and then suddenly in their favor, the memory never faded. Jack Mallory survived the war, barely. He flew escort over islands whose names blurred together, Leyte, Luzon, Okinawa, each one louder and bloodier than the last. By the time the surrender came, he had gray in his hair and a stiffness in his hands that never quite went away. When the engines finally fell silent, the quiet felt wrong, like the world had forgotten how to breathe. He returned home to parades, to handshakes, to people who wanted stories that ended cleanly. He gave them the safer ones. He never talked about the moment in the sky when fear nearly broke him, or how close he'd come to disappearing into the sea without a trace. Years later, at a small airfield museum, he stood before a restored P-38, polished, perfect, too perfect. A placard beneath it listed specifications, victories, kill ratios, nothing about the wire, nothing about the mechanic who'd worked through the night while everyone else slept. Jack reached out and rested his hand against the cold aluminum, feeling the echo of vibration that wasn't really there anymore. Somewhere, not far away, Eli Warren lived a quiet life. He never talked about the war unless pressed, and even then, only in half-finished sentences. He fixed lawnmowers. He repaired radios for neighbors. He preferred machines that didn't shoot back. Once, a young man asked him what it felt like to help win a war. Eli thought for a long time before answering. "It felt like doing what needed doing," he said finally. "Nothing more." History would remember the battles, the dates, the casualties, the turning points. It would remember generals and aces, victories and losses carved into stone. But it would never fully know the countless moments that balanced everything on a knife's edge. The quiet hands tightening a wire, the pilot trusting it with his life, the thin line between falling and flying, and somewhere, in the endless sky over the Pacific, that line still held. Decades later, the airfield was gone. The jungle had reclaimed the runway where metal once screamed skyward. Vines wrapped around broken concrete. Rusted fragments of steel lay half-buried in the soil, slowly dissolving back into the earth. The war had passed, and time had done what bombs could not, erased the scars until only echoes remained. A small group stood beneath the sun, hats in hand. Among them was a young historian, notebook tucked under his arm, listening as an aging veteran spoke in a voice made rough by years and memory. Jack Mallory's back was bent now, his hands spotted and trembling, but his eyes were still sharp when he looked toward the open sky. "We used to take off right there," he said, pointing to a strip of broken concrete swallowed by weeds. "Didn't know if we'd land again. Most days we didn't think about tomorrow. Just the next minute." The wind passed through the trees, carrying the distant sound of waves. For a moment, it almost sounded like engines climbing into the clouds. Jack closed his eyes. He remembered the feeling, weightlessness at the top of a climb, the roar of engines pushing past fear, the moment when instinct took over and the world narrowed to sky, steel, and survival. He remembered the wire, the impossible little fix that had given him a chance when there shouldn't have been one. Not luck, not destiny. Just someone refusing to accept that things had to stay broken. The historian finally asked the question he'd been waiting to ask all day. "Do you think the war would have ended differently if that hadn't happened?" Jack thought for a long time before answering. "No," he said softly. "Wars end when they end. Men fight, men die, and the world keeps turning." He looked back toward the empty airfield. "But I know this. Some of us came home because one man cared enough to try something small, and sometimes that's the only difference between being remembered and being gone." The wind moved through the grass again, carrying with it the echo of engines long silent. Above, the sky stretched low, wide and empty, long shadows across the broken runway, but forever marked by the stories it once carried. The historian packed his notes. The camera crew shut down their equipment. One by one, footsteps faded into the grass. Jack remained. He stood alone now, facing the open sky, listening to the quiet that only comes after a lifetime of noise. The wind brushed his jacket, gentle and patient, as if the world itself were giving him time to remember. He thought of the boys who never came back, their laughter in the mess hall, the way they'd argued over cards, the letters they'd carried folded in their pockets. He remembered the look in their eyes before a mission, fear buried under duty, hope wrapped in bravado. He thought of Eli. Not the legend history never wrote about, but the man hunched under a wing with oil-stained hands and a tired smile. The man who never fired a shot, yet saved more lives than he'd ever know. The war had taken much from them all, but it hadn't taken everything. Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn piece of metal, thin, bent, almost unremarkable, a fragment of wire kept all these years like a talisman. He turned it in his fingers, feeling its familiar weight. "Still did your job," he murmured. He placed the wire gently on the cracked concrete, letting it rest where runways once roared to life. Not as a monument, not as a marker, just a quiet offering. The sky above him glowed gold and then slowly deepened toward dusk. No engines, no alarms, only wind and memory. And somewhere beyond sight, beyond time, the echoes of aircraft still climbed into the sky, pilots trusting their machines, mechanics trusting their hands, all of them bound together by the thin, fragile thread of courage. History would never record every name. But the sky remembered. And that, Jack believed, was enough. The sun slipped fully below the horizon, and the air cooled with the quiet certainty of nightfall. Shadows stretched long across the forgotten airstrip, swallowing the last traces of concrete and steel. The world felt vast again, as it had before the war taught men how small they were. Jack turned away at last, walking slowly toward the path that led back to the road. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from age alone, but from the weight of memory settling back into place. He did not look behind him. He didn't need to. Somewhere beyond sight, the past lingered, not as ghosts, but as presence. Years later, long after Jack was gone, a group of students would visit the same island as part of a historical survey. They would find rusted fragments half buried in the soil, a twisted bolt, a corroded plate stamped with faded numbers. Nothing remarkable, nothing that would make a textbook. One student would pause longer than the others. "Do you think this mattered?" she would ask, holding up the fragment. Her professor would hesitate, then answer carefully. "Everything that survives long enough to be found mattered to someone." That night, the student would dream of aircraft cutting through clouds, of engines roaring against the wind, of men gripping control sticks with white-knuckled resolve. She would wake with the strange sense that she had been entrusted with something fragile and important, though she could not say what. And far beyond memory, beyond records and recognition, the legacy endured, not in medals or monuments, but in every quiet moment where courage went unseen. Because history is not only written by victories or defeats, it is written by hands that refuse to let go, by minds that chose to try, by small, stubborn acts of faith carried into the sky. And somewhere, in the endless blue above a once-forgotten airfield, that choice still moved on, as it always did, indifferent to memory, yet shaped by it. The airfield faded further into the jungle, swallowed by vines and rain and years of forgetting. Maps stopped marking it. Satellite images blurred it into green anonymity. But something remained, something quieter than history, stronger than neglect. On clear nights, when the wind swept in from the sea just right, the air above the old runway carried a strange stillness. Pilots flying high overhead sometimes felt it without knowing why. A subtle tightening in the chest, a sense of passing through a place where courage had once gathered like a storm. They never saw anything, but they felt it. In classrooms and workshops across the world, young men and women learned about engineering, aerodynamics, and the mathematics of flight. They studied equations and stress tolerances, lift and drag, margins and margins of error. Occasionally, one would hesitate over a problem, frown, and then try something unconventional, something not in the book. And sometimes that choice would work. No one would trace the line from that moment back to a forgotten mechanic under a canvas tarp in the Pacific. No one would connect it to a pilot gripping a control stick as the sky tried to kill him. But the line existed all the same, thin, unbroken, invisible. Because history isn't just a chain of great events. It's a quiet accumulation of small, defiant acts, a refusal to accept failure, a belief that something can be better, a hand reaching for a solution when none seems possible. Long after the engines fell silent, long after the last witness was gone, that belief endured. Not in museums, not in speeches, but in the simple human instinct to keep going, to fix what's broken, to trust in the unseen, and to rise into the unknown, even when the sky looks unforgiving. And so the story never truly ends. It just keeps flying.